Useless. Winter was harsh. This was knowledge he had practically been born with. Mother and father had meticulously tracked the changing of the seasons, always preparing, and never allowing the cold to sneak upon them unexpectedly. As a child, winter had been fun, providing a time to play and experiment with magic, to listen to stories as the small family huddled close, and to let his own cares slip away while his parents kept him safe, fed, and warm. Now, winter only brought with it concern and worry. Each new day brought more stress than the last, as the weather continued to be quite dour. Last night had been no different. The previous snowfall had scarcely begun to melt before another layer had been dumped on top, all overnight. Now he was hard-pressed to find a place to stand that did not have snow nearly reaching the top of his knees. And, almost as if fate were laughing at him, the snow was not nearly the worst part. He would have been fine with the snow, had grown up in far worse conditions, but it was different here. Winter was different. The illness, the variance of the temperatures, the rapidly changing weather patterns. It was all new, making it impossible to know what trials the season would bring upon his family, year after year. They were strangers in a strange land, one that did not want them. This was something that had been made abundantly clear to him as time trudged on, with the very land itself seeming to protest their presence. Not to mention the people who had already lived here. Though many years had passed since the Elme fled their original home for someplace new, they struggled to adapt. Disease plagued them, their own healers only capable of doing so much for an ailment that was not a physical injury, and the people of this land too mistrustful of outsiders to help them. They had ventured out before to try asking for help, only to receive very mixed receptions. At best, they were shunned, backs turned, and harsh words driving them away. At worst, well. Tokag's gaze locked with Ishlamar's, the two silently staring at one another without a single word passing between them. The last time anyone had traveled beyond the mountains, the Elme now called home, it had ended in a lot of bloodshed, and a green-scaled shadow perpetually following in his footsteps, like a ghost, haunting him. Ishlamar was still staring at him. Tokag broke the eye contact, gaze turning to his own loved hands as he deftly worked to secure a rope around the freshly killed carcass of a deer. Tokag was not above admitting that he wanted to go back home, but that was not an option anymore. The home he longed for no longer existed as it had been. Anything they had left behind would have surely been destroyed by now, and the people that made it out were here. He sighed, patting the flank of the deer as he started to stand. It was time to stop dwelling on the past. There was nothing in it for him besides memories. The survivors were what mattered, and they were currently sick and hungry. He had a job to do. He looked back up, ready to move on, only to be met by the gaze of Ishlamar once more, still staring at him. "Do you have nothing more important to do than stare at me?" he finally questioned, annoyance bleeding into his voice. Ishlamar slowly blinked, his ears twisting towards the sound. There was a moment of near-perfect silence, and it was in those few seconds that Tokag realized he already knew what Ishlamar was about to say. "Never mind," he muttered, scowling. "Do not bother answering that." Some variation of, "there is nothing more important than serving you," would have surely been Ishlamar's response. Tokag had grown tired of hearing it long ago, often finding that he missed the fiery temper Ishlamar had once displayed as a human. It had been humorous in many ways. Despite how pathetic the situation had been at the time, Ishlamar had never so much as hesitated before cursing at and threatening anyone who ever dared to try talking to him in those first few days. Tokag had been on the receiving end of the irate man's jabs multiple times. He would have been lying if he tried to hide that the arguments had given him some measure of satisfaction. At the time. It had felt right. Ishlamar's group had tried to slaughter them. Now, however, he had to convince himself anew each day that what they had done was right. What he had done. Tokag rubbed the back of his glove across his face, taking a deep breath and trying to clear his thoughts before motioning for Ishlamar. "Make yourself useful at least. Come here." The command was swiftly followed, the Shizi rising from the snow and bounding over without hesitation. A crack forming in the snow behind Ishlamar was the first indication that something was wrong. Silence descended over the mountain cliffside, save for the soft shuffling of the snow beneath Ishlamar's paws. Tokag stared at the crack, completely still. Meanwhile, the Shizi remained blissfully unaware of the change and continued jumping through the snow. "Ishlamar," he said abruptly, stern. "Stop moving." The Shizi stopped immediately, his ears perked up and visibly confused by the sudden change in command. Powdery snow broke away, softly sliding past. Tokag could only watch, holding his breath. And then the crack was growing. The ground that had felt so solid before now gave away beneath his feet, sending him sliding towards the edge of the cliff. He tried to call out to Ishlamar, to tell him to run, but his voice was choked out by the cloud of cold, white powder that washed over the pair. He lost sight of the green scales instantly, barely able to see his own hands as he desperately tried to find something sturdy he could hold on to, so the snow would not carry him further. His search proved to be futile. The only thing he managed to grab was more snow. And then, in one heart-clenching moment, the ground beneath him vanished entirely. "Ishlamar!" he screamed, terror taking hold of his mind as he suddenly found himself falling. For just a moment, time seemed to still. Tokag was elsewhere. Before him was the ocean, its waters calm and still, while the setting sun covered it in a stunning gold and red glow. Behind him stretched a city that never seemed to cease growing. It was comfortably nestled between the waters of the ocean and the distant mountains. Despite the peaceful scene, Tokag only knew pain and dread, as the ground itself seemed to be pulling him down, wings no longer able to support him, with an arrow pierced through his wing. The roar in his ears was the wind whipping past. He did not want to die. Not like this. Green caught his eye. Instinctively he reached out. Gloved hands, not talons, gripped scales, drawing Tokag from his own memories. He was not a bird this time. Things did not have to end the same way. Even as the thought crossed his mind, he was already beginning to lose his grip. Forced to let go, and in one last desperate attempt to save himself, Tokag's hands formed a gesture he knew by heart. Ice formed on the surface he had just been clinging onto, yet there was still nothing to grab. He was falling once more. Tokag cried out again, a sound of fear rather than words, broken only seconds later when something jerked on his left ankle. He was twisted upside down, having no time to react, as the face of the rocky cliff was racing towards him and... "Kag!" There was a voice. He could not quite recognize it through the ringing in his ears, but there was a sort of familiarity to it. As if he should. "Tokag!" He wished it would stop. Just for a little while. His head hurt, as if someone had been trying to crack his skull open, and so did the rest of his body. A few moments of blissful silence would have been appreciated. He tried to take a deep breath, noticing for the first time how hard it was to breathe. "Tokag, please!" There was the voice again. He frowned, annoyed. Could they not go away and leave him be? "Wake up!" "It's a wonder," he finally spoke, words slow and thick, hardly recognizable to even his own ears. "That Tokag has not thrown you off a cliff for being so noisy." Just for a moment, there were no other sounds. The voice had suddenly fallen quiet, presumably having heard and understood his words. Briefly, he thought they may have left, after realizing how irritating the constant screaming had been. His thoughts were proven wrong, however, at the sound of scraping above him. Something cold and wet landed on his face. "You did," the voice eventually responded. It sounded confused. And yourself. Tokag, are you okay? He had done what? Slowly his eyes opened. In front of him was a wall of solid rock, its edges rough and sharp. Blood was smeared across a small portion of the rock, which certainly would explain the burning sensation on the side of his face. And below, nothing but open air and the sharp rocks on the ground far, far below. He screamed, hands trying to grasp onto the rocky surface in panic, driven desperation to not fall further. There was a yelp and scraping above him, a small blob of snow landing on his face, just as it had done earlier. "No!" the voice shouted. "Please stop! We will fall!" With his fingers barely holding on to the rocky cliffside, he looked up. A short distance above him, a green-scaled figure clung to a ledge that jutted out from the cliff face. Ishlamar. That was Ishlamar. He remembered that much now. Tokag grimaced, shivering as a cold burst of wind blew against the exposed skin of his face. Above him, Ishlamar's grip on the ledge was tenuous at best. His claws were buried in the snow that had accumulated there, likely digging into the stone beneath. The only thing keeping Tokag from falling to his own death was a rope that had managed to wrap itself around his boot and ankle, but he wasn't entirely sure he trusted it to hold on for any significant length of time. "What happened?" Tokag questioned, hands letting go of the rock to hang limply below his head. The panic he had experienced at first was slowly ebbing away as he observed the situation they had now found themselves in. "The snow collapsed," Ishlamar responded, gazing down at Tokag in turn. It was only then that he noticed the ice Ishlamar's back paws clung to. It was clearly unnatural. Had he done that? Shutting his eyes for a moment, he tuned out the rest of the world while trying to remember exactly what had happened. Ishlamar's answer had been too vague. How had they gotten here? Why were they here? In Tokag's dismay, he was unsuccessful. Perhaps he had hit his head harder than he thought. So distracted was he that he barely noticed Ishlamar had continued speaking. "You were not responding. I thought..." Confused by the sudden pause, Tokag's eyes opened just in time to see Ishlamar look away. He had seen the expression on the Shizi's face, however. Sadness. Grief. "Were you worried about me?" he questioned, surprised. Ishlamar was blindly loyal, sure, thanks to the spell that had been used to bring him under control, but Tokag had always assumed that was the extent of it. Loyalty, a willingness to obey no matter the request, and nothing more. He had always imagined that Ishlamar would simply walk away, unconcerned, should he perish. Now, however, he questioned to just what extent the spell had altered Ishlamar's mind. Or... To even consider it made him feel sick, a pool of dread forming in his stomach. Was the concern genuine? Some sort of twisted attachment formed from the false emotions and thoughts created by the spell that Ishlamar believed were his own? He really didn't want to think about that right now. "Ishlamar?" he called out softly to draw the Shizi's attention back to him. It worked, gaze switching from the cliffside and back down to Tokag's face. Any emotion that had been present before was gone now. Not surprising, but somewhat disappointing. "How are you doing? Be honest, and do not lie. Speak freely with me for now." From a quick glance over, the best that he could do while hanging there did not appear to be any obvious injuries on the Shizi. Despite that, he wanted to be sure. Above him, Ishlamar shuffled his paws over so slightly and sent another pile of snow into Tokag's face. It was not on purpose, he knew that, but it was starting to get annoying. Still, he supposed he would prefer to deal with the snow in his face over falling off the entire mountain if Ishlamar had lost his grip. "I'm fine," Ishlamar responded. His tail scraped across the ice, scales brushing more snow off into Tokag's face. He wiped it away, annoyed, but still said nothing about it. Ishlamar did not seem to realize it was even happening. He had turned his head away already to look back up the cliff, likely searching for a way to climb out. "What are you going to do to get us out of this mess?" What makes you think I have any way of fixing this?" "You are a mage. Surely you can do something besides hang there and continue being useless." Tokag let out a surprised laugh, unable to control himself, while Ishlamar looked down at him without the slightest hint of emotion on his face. "Only a short while ago you were upset because you thought I had split my skull open and died. And now you are insulting me. When I told you to speak freely, this is not what I meant." Running his hands through his hair revealed blood, though significantly less pain. That was an improvement, at least. "Please, do continue." He briefly wondered what his face looked like. He was not bleeding quite as much, at least as far as he could tell, but he was certain it looked awful. Ishlamar was still watching him, waiting. Sighing, Tokag turned his attention to his ankle. That was currently the source for the worst of his pain, but also the only thing keeping him from plummeting to his death on the rocks far below. It was pure luck that the rope wrapped itself around him like this. It was not secure, far from it, but it was a tight enough hold that he felt confident it would remain safe for a little while longer, if he did not move around too much. The other end was wrapped around Ishlamar's torso. He faintly remembered the Shizi not being close enough for him to have done that. Either on accident or a smart move from Ishlamar, it was this random act that was saving his life right now. "Ishlamar, I hate to break your confidence in my ability to do anything about this, but don't say it. There is nothing I can do." A soft thud and the sound of scales scraping against rocks immediately followed Tokag's words. "You really are useless," Ishlamar grumbled, his face pressed against the side of the cliff. The echoing sound of Tokag's laughter filled the cliff tops. "Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in, out." The commands repeated over and over in his head, a reminder lest he forget. An entire day had been spent here, hanging from a cliffside with Ishlamar. Memories had returned to him, slowly at first, until he could see each horrifying second of their fall in his mind with startling clarity. It had been morning when they set out to hunt, and now dusk was approaching, the distant horizon being painted in what would have been lovely red and dark blue hues were it not for the pressure he felt in his chest. Breathe. Remember to breathe. All pain had been forgotten, save for this. The potential threat of suffocating, overwhelming, and removing any possibility for other thoughts. "Tokag?" He was startled by the sudden sound of his own name, blurry gaze shifting to Ishlamar. Tokag had almost forgotten about the Shizi in the silence. He had not spoken for quite a while. "What is—" He paused, gasping for air. Oh, this was not good. "Et. Do you think anyone will be coming to save us?" "Sick," he managed to get out, pressing shaky hands against his face. "Everyone is sick." "Yes, but surely—" Tokag shook his head, and Ishlamar stopped speaking, taking the gesture as his answer. There would be no help. None of the others, besides the children, were well enough to venture out, and the Shizi would certainly not do it alone. Estelle was not likely to help either. What was it she had said? He should have died instead, or something like that. He tried to not dwell on their last argument very much. Regardless, it seemed like she might get her wish now. Except him dying was not very likely to bring back their father. "I am afraid." His thoughts were once again interrupted by Ishlamar's voice. Lowering his hands from his face, Tokag stared at the great cliff that was becoming increasingly harder to see in the steadily fading light. Even if he could have gotten the words out without being left gasping for air, Tokag was not sure he'd ever admit to Ishlamar that he felt the same way. Tokag! Cold. He was so cold. Everything hurt and was so fuzzy. His mind was numb, the screaming barely managing to pierce the void that called to him, promising warmth. He could hear howling. Somewhere. Tokag! Open your eyes! Tokag! Why Ishlamar screaming for him eluded him. Despite the intense burning in his chest, he felt everything was fine. He only needed to rest. It is almost over. Come on! He could remember a hand, comforting and familiar, though he was not entirely sure who it had been, or when, and where. He wanted it back, though. He felt movement, but paid it no mind. He was content, until a heavy weight slammed into his chest. Tokag suddenly inhaled, eyes snapping open. Through extremely blurred vision in the darkness, he could see another person's face. And mottled scales. Was Merman here? Then that meant... Give him space. He'll be all right. Elias. As Tokag continued to cough, rolling onto his side, only to then realize that he could. That solid ground was beneath him. He felt a hand briefly rest against his shoulder. Steadily the coughing died down, as his breathing evened out, only to be replaced with an intense sensation of nausea. The hand on his shoulder was removed. Is he? He'll be fine, Ishlamar. Elias moved, standing up as if the noise he made was any indication. As long as he's breathing, he'll be okay. He's just cold. We need to get him home. He stopped, just when Merban arrived. I know. Tokag groaned, shutting his eyes. Had he passed out at some point? There was a suspicious gap in his memory between him and Ishlamar talking, and the Shizi screaming at him. He shivered. It was probably best not to think about that right now. Merban, Ishlamar, I'm going to need your help to get him home. Tokag did not hear what either of the Shizi said in response, allowing himself to drift off. And this time, no one screamed at him to wake up. Later, he could ask questions and figure out what had happened. For now, he just wanted to rest.